In the 1400s, men's jackets became so short that Parliament passed a law. The new rule? Your clothes had to be long enough to cover your genitals and buttocks. This is not exaggeration. It was the law of the land, one of the several statutes passed in medieval England to police what a man could and could not wear. We tend to think of fashion as a modern obsession and its regulation as something aimed at women. For centuries, the opposite was true. In the late Middle Ages, high fashion was a man's game. And in England, the law was intensely interested in that game. These were the Sumptuary Laws, and they reveal a world where clothing was power. This is the story of how the English elite weaponized fashion, creating a complex social code written in fabric, fur, and thread. It is a story about class, morality, and a battle over the very meaning of manhood. To understand this story, you must first step into the world of 14th century and 15th century England. It was a society structured by intricate hierarchies of status, rank, and wealth. In a world without mass media or corporate branding, the most immediate and powerful way to display that status was through clothing. Before the great masculine reunification of the 19th century gave us the sober, uniform suits of today, men's fashion was as vibrant, varied, and opulent as women's, if not more so. The sheer expense of materials meant that garments carried immense symbolic weight. A single outfit could cost more than a laborer earned in a year. King Richard II, for instance, once spent £9, the equivalent of a minor merchant's annual income, just for 2 pieces of gold embroidered cloth for himself and an esquire. This was the age when fashion, as we understand it, was born in the courts of Europe. But as stylish courtiers sought the transformative power of new clothes, other men of the ruling classes looked to police their personal finery. So what exactly were these laws, and who were they really meant for? These were called the Sumptuary Laws. The term comes from the Latin word for expenditure, sumptus, and the laws aimed at regulating consumption. While they existed across Europe, the English case was unique. In Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, sumptuary laws became obsessed with controlling the dress of women. Lawmakers meticulously detailed the types of fabrics and the styles of headdresses their wives and daughters could wear. This was seen as a mark of masculine honor to keep one's woman in check. In England, the legislators were relatively unconcerned with women's attires. From 1337 to the early 1500s, 10 national attempts were made to regulate apparel. Of the 6 that became statutes, nearly all focused overwhelmingly on the clothing of men. The story of these laws began not with the kings or the great lords, but in the House of Commons. In medieval England, the Commons was the domain of knights, esquires, gentlemen, and wealthy townsmen, the upper middle tiers of the social pyramid. It was from their ranks that the repeated calls for clothing regulation emerged. But the story of who wrote these laws is where things get truly interesting. The men petitioning for these laws were the very men being regulated. They were, in effect, campaigning to restrain their own consumption. Why would they do this? Their motives reveal a complex game of social strategy. On one level, there were economic concerns. The preamble to the 1363 petition explicitly states that the price of goods had increased because people were wearing apparel not appropriate for their station. Lavish spending on imported silks and furs drained bullion from the realm. By placing legal limits on who could wear what, these men could protect their own incomes from the social pressures of keeping up with extravagant trends. If a statute forbade a knight from wearing ermine, he could have a perfect excuse for his thrift without losing face. The driving force, however, was social. These laws were a sophisticated tool for managing status in a world where social mobility, especially after the Black Death, was a source of anxiety. The statute drew a clear, legally enforceable line in the sand. On the top of this group were the knights and the wealthy city officials. They were permitted a significant level of luxury, most silks, velvets, and imported wools, but they were barred from the absolute peak of luxury, cloth of gold, purple silk, and the precious fur of sable, and gemstones were generally reserved for the titled nobility. Immediately below them were the esquires and gentlemen. Their statutorial world was far more restricted. For them, no cloth of gold, no velvets, and no expensive furs like the miniver or ermine. Their wardrobe was meant to be one of modest English wool and the fur of common animals like rabbit and fox. The laws created a visible language of power. A man's income, his profession, and his social standing were instantly legible from the clothes on his back. This system did more than just preserve the hierarchy. It also constructed an ideal of masculinity for these men. By renouncing the most extreme forms of luxury, the Knights of the Common fashioned themselves as models of a particular kind of manhood, responsible, sober, and respectable. They were not the decadent, untouchable elite. They were the dependable backbone of the kingdom, men of substance whose status was built on land and service, not flashy clothes. This was a masculinity of moderation. The tension between fashion and regulation reached its peak in the mid-15th century. A new daring style had taken hold among fashionable young men. Jackets and cloaks, known as doublets, became radically short. At this time, hose, the precursor to modern trousers, were tailored to be skin-tight. This combination created a problem. The new abbreviated jackets often failed to cover the point where the two separate legs of the hose met, leaving a man's genitals and buttocks barely concealed. The situation prompted the invention of the codpiece, a padded pouch designed to cover and often accentuate a man's anatomy. Clerical writers were scandalized. Geoffrey Chaucer's Parson had condemned the style a century earlier, complaining that men showed, quote, the horrible swollen members that seemed like the malady of hernia, end quote, and that their buttocks looked like, quote, the hind parts of a she-ape at the time of full moon. The men in Parliament agreed. The statutes of 1463, originating once again from a petition in the Commons, took direct aim at this trend. It declared that no man under the estate of a lord, whether knight, esquire, or gentleman, should wear any gown, jacket, or cloak so short that, quote, it does not cover his private members and buttocks. The same law also targeted other fashionable excesses. Shoes with long, pointed toes, known as pikes. The statute decreed that for any man below a lord, these points could be no longer than 2 inches. But why was this fashion so offensive? And why were there so many powerful men in the kingdom allowed to flout the rules? The most prevailing part of these clauses is who was exempted. The titled elite, the lords, dukes, and earls, were free to wear their jackets as short and their shoes as pointy as they pleased. Sartorial excess and blatant sexuality were permitted, even protected, as a marker of their hegemonic masculinity. Their rank, if implied, placed them beyond the moral standards applied to lesser men. For the knights and gentlemen in Parliament, however, modesty was now a legal requirement. But while Parliament obsessed over men's hemlines, what about the other half of the population? While English lawmakers policed men's jackets, they displayed a remarkable lack of interest in what women wore. This stands in stark contrast to the rest of Europe. For much of the 14th and 15th century, the statutes simply included a refrain stating that wives and daughters should follow the same rules as men of their rank. Then, starting in the late 15th century, something remarkable happened. The laws began to actively exempt women from its provisions. The 1483 statute went so far as to declare that all women, except the wives of servants and laborers, were exempt from all sumptuary provisions. The leniency points to the different roles women played in English and Italian society. In Italy, where women had limited legal and economic outlets, their dress became a primary canvas for displaying their family's wealth. Displaying that control was a way for men to assert their authority. In England, aristocratic women, including those of the knightly class, often played a more active and instrumental role in managing family estates, finances, and political networks. They were partners in the family enterprise. Because their value was not purely symbolic or decorative, there was less need to police their appearance with the same rigor. English patriarchy had a different flavor. It worked by equating women with the status of their husbands while still subordinating them in law and custom. The medieval England sumptuary laws were never truly about stopping people from dressing above their station. Enforcement records are almost non-existent, and evidence from wills suggests a high level of compliance. This is unsurprising, as the men making these laws were largely content to abide by them. The true purpose of the legislation was more subtle. It was a project of identity construction. For the Knights of the Commons, these laws were a way to navigate their precarious position in the social hierarchy. In their home counties, these men were lords of the manor, but in Parliament, they were subordinate to the great nobles. At the same time, the line separating a wealthy knight from a prosperous esquire was becoming dangerously blurred, the sumptuary laws were a solution. By legislating a masculinity of moderation for themselves, the knights performed a kind of complicit masculinity. They formed the existing power structure, acknowledging the superior status of their nobility by leaving the most extravagant fashions to them. In return for this deference, they received their patriarchal dividends, access to wealth, local power, and a voice in government. Simultaneously, the laws drew a sharp, visible line between themselves and the gentry below. They reinforced the prestige of knighthood, making it a distinct and legally protected status. It was a masterful act of social engineering. It stabilized the hierarchy, but not by brute force, but by creating a shared understanding of what different kinds of men look like. In a modern world where clothes are cheap and fashion is fleeting, it's difficult to grasp the power that garments once had. But the English sumptuary laws remind us that for centuries, clothing was a language of power, a public declaration of one's place in the world. They show us a society where men, in a collective act of self-regulation, use the law to define the very essence of their manhood and one specific place in the intricate hierarchy of men.